Why do so many people operate their table saws without these blade guards in place? I'll tell you exactly why I don't operate my table saw with this blade guard in place. It's because it's a big, giant, bulky, view blocking, cumbersome piece of crap. There, I said it. Hi everybody, I'm Jim Deerdorf and this is Detroit DIY. Let's take a closer look at this thing. First of all, before we get going, I just want to say that this video is based on my opinion of this blade guard. It should not alter what you are doing with your table saw. If you're using this blade guard and you're having success with it, then you should keep using this blade guard. However, I am going to go over my opinion on these blade guards and exactly why I don't use it. In the early 1990s, the Consumer Product Safety Commission decided that the table saws needed to have some type of a guard to protect your fingers from the blade. This was not very well thought out. They mandated certain things be here. However, no one really looked at the functionality of the saw and could this be used all the time. They just mandated some certain features, and this is what the table saw companies had to make. The table saw companies themselves know that basically you can only make rip cuts with this in place, and wider rip cuts. You can't do narrow rip cuts. You can't set your blade to a 45. You can't use a sled. You can't use some push blocks like the gripper, which is designed to go over the top of the blade. You just can't do a lot of things with this in place. Let's take a closer look at why. Let's say you want to cut a 1-inch thick strip of wood. You can't do it. And my blade guard locks up, and that's what I just did. I pulled it up into the lock position. When I'm setting up my fence, I like to use my tape measure against my fence and not so much the tape measure that's provided on the saw. When we get over here, let's see how far we can get. We can get no closer than 1 3/8 of an inch. So, and we are up against the blade guard. We can't cut anything thinner because of the thickness of the blade guard. So if you want to cut a 1-inch strip, guess what? The blade guard has to go. One of the other things that I don't like about this blade guard is that it blocks my view of what the blade is doing. Yes, if I've measured everything out and I know that I want a 6 or a 4-inch cut, this shouldn't affect me, but it does. I don't like the way that these stick way up in my way. It's cumbersome to try and stand over here where I'm standing on the left side of my saw where I'm nice and safe and push a piece of material through, because these stupid things stick up so far that it's just ridiculous. It almost forces you to stand here in a danger zone to push your material through. I don't want to stand in the danger zone. I want to be over here so that if there is an ejection or a kickback, that material is going to miss me and fly and hit the wall. It's not going to hit me. The next issue I have, and why I say this wasn't thought through very well at all, is if you want to do an angle cut. If you want to do an angle cut, this thing just doesn't work. It just all tilts up weird, binds the saw up. That's about all I can get out of it right there. I can't even get a 45 because these pawls are bound up. Everything's just bound up. It's sitting here all weird and cumbersome. It's just not what you want. They just didn't think this part through at all. So if you're going to make an angle cut, what happens then? You have to take it off. So really and truly, this was only designed to make a 90-degree cut. And that's, I don't know, I could put it on every time I made a 4 or 5-inch, 6-inch, 90-degree cut. But then again, if I used this thing regularly, I would definitely chop this. I'd chop it apart. I'd make it much smaller and more minimal. I don't understand what these things are for. The next part of this that I truly don't understand is why they put the anti-kickback pawls way back here. Now these won't really stop a kickback. They may stop an ejection, and you really only have an ejection issue when you're cutting a thin strip of wood. It's the only time I'm worried about an ejection. And when you're cutting a thin strip of wood, you can't have these in place because it won't let the fence get over far enough. If these were here to prevent a kickback typically occurs when the wood is in this area right here before it even reaches these. So again, kind of makes no sense as to why these are located so far back here, other than they're to make you feel better about using your saw, but they're in the wrong place to actually be functional. And the reason for that is this prevents the wood from gripping the back side of the blade. And the back side of the blade, since it's rotating toward you, the back side of the blade is the lifting action. That's what's trying to lift the wood. That's why I like to use push blocks and other things to make sure that I have that down pressure. You have to have that down pressure on the wood. So I really don't want this in my way. When I feel like using a push block to feed my material through is much safer because I'm controlling the wood better with my push block and putting down force on it. Sometimes wood develops tension, and that tension can squeeze the wood back together as you're cutting it, closing the kerf of the cut up. If that happens without the riving knife, it'll basically squeeze onto the back of the blade. If it squeezes onto the back of the blade, it's just going to lift it up, and then it's game on. When this wood starts to lift up, it's going to kick back. It's going to throw it at you. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. And that's the whole purpose of this riving knife. Well, there's two purposes to the riving knife. One is that it's going to prevent this from squeezing back together and grabbing the back of the blade. And the second is that it's not going to allow the piece, your workpiece, to go sideways once you start cutting it, or it's going to restrict it greatly unless it breaks it into two pieces, because now it's just kind of locked in there. So even a side pressure to the back of the blade is not good, but the riving knife prevents that from happening. If you are a beginner to using a table saw, I would highly suggest that you make your first cuts with this blade guard in place. I would suggest that you use your table saw for the first 50 or 60 hours with this blade guard in place. Develop the proper practices. If you don't like the blade guard at that point in time, hopefully you have developed the proper practices into what you can use to keep yourself safe without this blade guard. Turn your saw off after every cut. Never reach over the blade. There's a lot of things that you can do to keep yourself safe, and that's what we all want. We want all our fingers, we want everything. So you have to remain safe using the table saw. The table saw requires 100% of your focus. Not listening to podcasts, not any of that stuff. This tool demands 100% of your focus, and that's what you have to give it. Whether you're using these blade guards and anti-kickback pawls or not, it requires 100% of your attention. My next big issue with this blade guard is that it doesn't allow me to get my board under it smoothly and freely. I just don't like that about this blade guard. They may not all be this way, but this one is. And what I mean by that is when I'm starting my cut and my blade, my workpiece right now is incredibly close to my blade, about 4 inches away, but it doesn't want to go under. I am putting an immense amount of force to get it to go under. It does not want to go under it, and it's like you got to kind of bang it into it. I don't like doing that on the table saw. When I just did that there, my workpiece kind of moved away from my fence. It would have caused me to start my cut a little crooked. I just do not like that about this. As you can see, you got to bump it in there to get the thing to lift up. it's just too cumbersome. This is not shaped properly. This is too steep. It needs to be more tapered so that the wood can just lift it up nice and easy. But that's not what happens. And that's another reason why I don't like to use this. The table saw, in my opinion, needs to be a smooth, steady operation. I shouldn't be having to bang my wood underneath of this thing to get it to lift up. So it's just poor design. Once again, just a bulky, cumbersome, poor design. And I understand they were mandated to make them this way, but it would have made so much more sense had they just made a very small cover to cover your blade up. It would raise up and down with your riving knife. It would always clear your wood, and it would completely cover the top of the blade. But it's so simple that, and you could make thin cuts, but that's not what the Consumer Product Safety Commission wanted. They wanted this big giant bulky thing that kind of forces us to remove it to do some of the cuts that we want to do. I know I'm not alone on how I feel about this blade guard. I watch some woodworking and construction YouTube channels myself. If you watch Woodworking with Mere Mortals, you'll notice that he never uses any of this stuff, but he will talk about this riving knife and why you should be using this riving knife and how important it is. If you watch Finished Carpentry TV, you will never see any of these blade guards in place on his table saw, but you will see the riving knife. If you watch 731 Woodworks, you will also never see these blade guards in place. A lot of these people feel the exact same way that I do. Andy Bird Builds, if you watch any of his videos, you won't see these blade guards in place. In fact, in one of Andy Bird's videos, he obviously, he was listening to a podcast, he became complacent in operating his table saw. He reached in to get an offcut and stuck his fingers right in the blade. Cut 2 of his fingers, I believe. He has a video on it. If you look up Andy Bird Builds, he's very forward about what happened, and it changed his opinion. You know, like I say, you have to give these tools 100% of your focus. You shouldn't be listening to a podcast. I don't even like to use hearing protection because the sound of the saw, the pitch, the tone that it's making while I'm cutting a piece of wood is important to me, because if I hear binding or I hear the saw slowing down, I know that something's going to happen before it happens. And I'm just going to hold that board in place and I'm going to turn the saw off. I'm going to take a good look at what's going on, why that's happening. I've also been cutting a piece of long pine before that I was ripping down 6-inch pieces into 2.5-inch strips or something like that. And there was a lot of tension in it, like I was just talking about. And I was feeding it through. It was an 8-foot long piece. I was feeding it through and it stopped feeding. It didn't want to push anymore. If that ever happens to you, turn the saw off and figure out what's going on. In my case, this was just squeezing shut, and it had so much tension on it that it was grabbing the riving knife and not allowing me to push it anymore. What I did to correct that was I spread the board apart and I put a shim in here, and I completed my cut. But I completed my cut safely without the board trying to squeeze back in. The other thing I want to say is that most of your kickbacks, now to me, there's 2 different kinds of kickbacks. There's a kickback, which is when the back of the blade grabs the board, lifts it up, and throws it out of the saw. And then there's an ejection. An ejection typically happens when you're cutting those thinner strips and the saw blade grabs it as soon as the cut is complete and just shoots it out of the saw like a spear. It doesn't fly in the air, it just shoots straight out of the saw. A kickback is going to fly in the air. So they're all labeled kickback. And in my opinion, they shouldn't be. One should be an ejection, one should be a kickback. And this way it helps people to better understand what the issues are with cutting different pieces of wood. An ejection can occur with any length piece of wood, 8 feet long, 10 feet long. It can eject that piece out and it'll do it in a hurry. Kickbacks typically only occur with smaller pieces of wood. The reason for that is that the smaller pieces of wood can, if they bind up and if there's an issue, it'll throw it out. If you're cutting an 8-foot piece of wood, you can still experience a kickback, but the good part of that is that piece of material is too big for the saw to just hurl it back at you. It might jump up out of the saw, but you're going to exactly know what's going on. It might grab it, it might get ugly for a second, but it's not going to launch it at you like a missile like it will these smaller pieces of wood. So it's important to know that cutting thin strips and ripping smaller pieces of wood are where your dangers are at. This blade guard is not going to prevent any type of a kickback or ejection. This blade guard is going to protect you from sticking your fingers in this blade while the saw is running. Make it a practice. Complete your cut, keep your fingers away from your blade, use your push sticks, use your push blocks, use anything that you can, even if they're homemade push blocks, push sticks, the ones that come with the saw. Anything that you can to push this through and keep your fingers away from the blade. If you're making thinner cuts, never be putting your fingers here holding this piece of wood down while you're running it through. You are just too close to the blade. That's crazy to try and push a piece of wood through with your fingers that close to the blade. Alright guys, that's my beef with these blade guards. I wish they were much more simpler. I really do. I wish they were so simple, so narrow, and just covered the top of the blade. If they covered the top of the blade, allowed me to do my 45 cuts, make all my cuts I wanted. If I could drop my sled on here and put it back on over the top of my sled, in which some cases you can because my riving knife raises up and down with my blade like most saws do. I would use something like that all the time. This big bulky cumbersome thing, I just don't like it and I won't use it. And like I say, this is my opinion and it has, no bearing on your opinion. So if you use all this stuff, use all this stuff. I'm glad you do, and I'm glad you're trying to be safe. I just feel as though I can be safer without this in my way. If you guys would, jump down in the comments. Let me know if you use your blade guard, or if you don't use your blade guard, how you feel about these things. Do you also find them to be big, bulky, and cumbersome, and basically just get in your way? I'd really like to hear from you guys on this. Alright guys, that's all we got for this time. If you haven't subscribed yet, I would greatly appreciate it if you would consider doing so. And remember to always respect the power of your power tools. We'll see you soon.